Imagine a vast ocean, stretching endlessly under the blazing sun, and upon it, massive ships cutting through the waves. These were no ordinary vessels, they carried a cargo unlike anything the world had seen. Human lives, torn from their homes, their families, and their futures. Between 1500 and 1900, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from West and Central Africa and shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas. They were not just numbers, they were mothers and fathers, children, farmers, musicians, and leaders. Each carried dreams, memories, and identities that would be stripped away by a system built entirely for profit. The journey they faced was known as the Middle Passage, a term that hides the unimaginable suffering endured during the voyage. Crowded into the dark, suffocating holds of ships, these men, women, and children were forced to survive conditions that would challenge even the strongest of wills. The air was thick with heat, the smell unbearable, and space nearly non-existent. Many succumbed to disease, starvation, or despair long before ever reaching the shores they were brought to. Yet, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, stories of courage and resistance emerged. Some captives found ways to fight back, to assert their dignity, and to reclaim their freedom whenever possible. Their resilience is a testament to the human spirit, a reminder that even when stripped of freedom, people's courage and determination can shine through. Today, the echoes of this history continue to shape our world. The African diaspora spread across continents, influencing cultures, traditions, music, and communities throughout the Americas. Understanding this history is not just about acknowledging past wrongs, it is about honoring the strength, resilience, and humanity of those who endured unimaginable hardships. As we explore this story, we will step aboard these ships in our minds, hear the voices of those who survived, and uncover the truths of a journey that forever changed the lives of millions. This is not just history, it is a human story of suffering, courage, and the enduring quest for freedom. If you find these stories as compelling and important as we do, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming episodes exploring untold histories from around the world. Together, we can uncover the past, learn from it, and share these lessons with everyone eager to understand the depth and resilience of humanity. The story of the Middle Passage is not only one of physical suffering, but also of the profound erasure of identity, a stripping away of the very essence that made each person who they were. Enslaved Africans, torn from the lands of West and Central Africa, were forced into a system that saw them not as human beings but as commodities. Their names, families, professions, and dreams rendered meaningless in the eyes of those who sought to profit from their labor. The people captured and transported were not merely workers in the Jarrick sense, they were farmers who tended the fertile lands of their villages, merchants who understood trade and negotiation, priests and spiritual leaders who guided communities, soldiers who defended their homes and people, and musicians whose rhythms and songs told the stories of their lives and heritage. Yet upon being seized, all these layers of identity were flattened into a single, tragic label: slave. Imagine the confusion and fear as these men, women, and children were torn from the only lives they had ever known, marched for days to the coast, and held in fortified compounds while waiting for the ships that would carry them into the unknown. They were stripped of their clothing, their hair often cut or shaved, and subjected to medical inspections that treated their bodies as cargo rather than vessels of life and experience, even as they clung to the few possessions, memories, and rituals that remained. The world around them sought to deny their past and their humanity. Every step of the journey, from capture to the shipboard voyage across the Atlantic, was designed to dehumanize, to break connections to culture, language, and family that had defined them for generations. On board the ships, the cruel calculus of survival dictated every action. Men were shackled together, forced into cramped spaces that made movement nearly impossible, while women were sometimes left unchained but constantly vulnerable to the attentions of the crew. Children, often separated from parents and siblings, had no refuge from the overwhelming fear and confusion surrounding them. The smells of unwashed bodies, the heat of the sun beating down on the decks, and the stench from the necessary waste tubs below deck combined to create an environment designed to crush both body and spirit. Disease spread rapidly in this confined space, and the constant threat of punishment and even death created a psychological weight as crushing as the physical confinement. Yet even under these conditions, fragments of identity persisted. Whispered songs, shared memories, and silent gestures connected people to the lives they had left behind. The erasure of identity was compounded by the way these ships were organized and operated. Captains and crews, motivated by profit and the rules of maritime insurance, focused on ensuring that cargo reached the Americas in a state suitable for sale, often showing no concern for the lives or suffering of the people themselves. Those who became ill or were deemed troublesome might be thrown overboard, their deaths considered merely a financial calculation. Yet the human spirit resisted even here. Revolts and acts of defiance aboard ships were not only a fight for survival but also an assertion of identity in a world that sought to deny it. Men and women remembered who they were and refused to be reduced to objects. Some uprisings, like the famed revolt on the Amistad or the many documented cases across the 18th and 19th centuries, demonstrated extraordinary courage, skill, and solidarity, challenging the authority of the crews and asserting humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The personal stories that have come down through history, like those of Oloda Equiano, reveal the inner lives of individuals who endured the Middle Passage. Equiano recounted not only the terror and brutality of the voyage, but also the small acts of resistance and the bonds formed among captives that allowed them to survive psychologically and spiritually. Similarly, the story of Matilda McCree, who survived the illegal transport on the Clotilda, reminds us that identity, while battered and challenged, was never entirely extinguished, even in a world that sought to erase names. Family ties and cultural practices. Individuals maintained connections to their heritage, to memories of home, and to one another. The implications of this erasure were felt for generations. Families were split apart, and communities were deprived of leaders, teachers, and healers. Yet, paradoxically, the very attempt to erase identities contributed to the resilience and creativity of the African diaspora. Cultural practices, languages, music, and religious beliefs were adapted, preserved, and transformed in the Americas, allowing people to retain a sense of who they were even under oppressive circumstances. The Middle Passage was a crucible of both suffering and endurance, and the persistence of identity in the face of such systematic dehumanization is a testament to the strength and ingenuity of the human spirit. By understanding these stories, we are invited to see beyond the statistics of the transatlantic slave trade and into the lives of real people whose individuality, talents, and humanity were disregarded by a system built to commodify them. This recognition calls not only for remembrance but also for reflection on the ways human dignity can endure even when stripped away by violence and oppression. As we explore this history, it becomes clear that acknowledging the loss and the resilience of identity is essential to understanding the full impact of the Middle Passage and the enduring legacy of those who survived it. The Middle Passage, a term that masks the unspeakable suffering endured by millions, represents one of the darkest chapters in human history, A journey across the Atlantic where the value of human life was measured in profit rather than in dignity or compassion. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and crammed into the holds of slave ships. But the journey itself was deadly, claiming the lives of around 1.8 million people before they ever reached the Americas. Each figure in these grim statistics represents a story abruptly cut short, a family torn apart, a culture disrupted, and an identity subjected to relentless violence and erasure. The conditions aboard these vessels were designed to contain human bodies as efficiently as possible. Yet the cruel efficiency of the system could not prevent the spread of disease, the ravages of starvation, or the devastation wrought by heat, filth, and despair. The voyage often lasted between 2 and 4 months, with captives enduring confinement so extreme that even the simplest act of movement became a challenge. Men were shackled in pairs below deck, barely able to turn or sit. And women, though sometimes left unshackled, were confined within cramped compartments, vulnerable not only to the oppressive physical conditions but also to the predatory attentions of the crew. Children were often left without the comfort of parental guidance, navigating fear and confusion in the darkness of the hold. The combination of heat, inadequate ventilation, and unsanitary conditions created a breeding ground for disease, and epidemics of dysentery, smallpox, and other illnesses swept through the human cargo with relentless cruelty. The fear of death was omnipresent, not only from sickness but also from the arbitrary violence meted out by captains and crews, who sought to maintain control over the prisoners and protect their investment at any cost. Food and water were meager, rationed in strict accordance with the profit-driven calculations of the voyage. Starvation became a daily reality for many, and the psychological toll of hunger and thirst added to the already unbearable suffering. Captives often witnessed the deaths of those around them, the groans and cries of their fellow prisoners echoing through the holds, amplifying the sense of hopelessness. For some, the conditions were so unbearable that death became preferable to life aboard the ship, and desperate acts of resistance, including rebellion or even suicide, emerged as both expressions of agency and tragic attempts to escape the relentless torment. These deaths were not incidental. They were the inevitable consequence of a system that prioritized profit over human life, a system that viewed the bodies of men, women, and children as commodities rather than as living, breathing individuals with histories, families, and aspirations. One of the most notorious examples highlighting the callous calculus of mortality during the Middle Passage is the tragedy of the Zong in 1781, where over 100 captives were deliberately thrown overboard in an attempt to claim insurance compensation. This incident, while shocking in its brutality, was not an isolated case. Similar acts occurred across countless voyages, illustrating the grim reality that human lives were expendable and that death at sea was a routine hazard for those enslaved. Yet, even amidst such calculated cruelty, the human spirit manifested in acts of resistance, solidarity, and endurance. Stories of revolt, such as those aboard the Amistad, the Creole, and numerous lesser-known vessels, demonstrate that captives refused to surrender their humanity quietly. These uprisings were not merely acts of desperation but statements of defiance, asserting that identity, dignity, and life itself could not be entirely stripped away, even under the most dehumanizing conditions. As we reflect on these staggering numbers and the lived experiences behind them, it becomes clear that the Middle Passage was more than a transportation system. It was a crucible of suffering, endurance, and resilience. The death of 1.8 million people, though immense, represents only a portion of the trauma inflicted, as countless survivors arrived in the Americas physically weakened, psychologically scarred, and uprooted from everything familiar. Yet, these survivors carried with them the seeds of culture, knowledge, and resilience that would shape the African diaspora. Their endurance in the face of unimaginable conditions, their ability to maintain fragments of language, music, ritual, and memory, and their eventual contributions to societies across the Americas testify to the power of human spirit to withstand and transcend oppression. Understanding the mortality and suffering of the Middle Passage is essential not only to acknowledge the immense human cost of the transatlantic slave trade, but also to honor the strength and courage of those who survived. Each statistic represents a life that mattered, a story that should not be forgotten, and a reminder of the resilience that has allowed communities to endure and thrive despite the horrors of the past. This awareness invites us to engage with history in a way that is both reflective and empathetic, recognizing the profound suffering endured while celebrating the enduring human spirit that survived. Before even stepping foot on the ships that would carry them across the Atlantic, the fates of countless African captives were sealed in the villages and towns of West and Central Africa, where raiding parties, often aided by local intermediaries, sought human cargo to sell to European traders. These were not distant strangers in an abstract history. They were neighbors, friends, and family, caught in a web of betrayal, opportunism, and violence that reshaped entire communities. The process of capture was sudden and terrifying. Children playing in the fields, women tending to their homes, and men working the land could find themselves seized in moments, their lives irrevocably altered by the coordinated efforts of raiders who moved with deadly precision and efficiency. In some cases, these captives were taken by force, hunted down by armed bands who had mastered the terrain and the fear that gripped their victims. In others, local rulers or merchants participated willingly, enticed by European goods or promises of wealth, creating a tragic complicity that blurred the lines between oppressor and victim within African societies themselves. The psychological impact of these seizures cannot be overstated. For those captured, the sudden loss of home, family, and familiar surroundings created a sense of dislocations so profound that it would accompany them across the ocean. Parents were often torn from children, siblings separated, and entire families scattered. The captives were marched to the coast, sometimes for weeks or months, forced to navigate harsh terrain and endure extreme deprivation along the way. Hunger, thirst, exposure to the elements, and the constant threat of violence marked every step of the journey, leaving deep scars both physically and mentally. Those who survived these forced marches arrived at the slave forts along the coast in a state of exhaustion and despair, only to face another layer of suffering as they were sold, inspected, and prepared for transport across the Atlantic. At the coastal forts, such as Elmina and Goree Island, captives were held in confined spaces, awaiting the arrival of the ships that would carry them to the Americas. The European traders, motivated by profit, relied heavily on the networks and systems established by local intermediaries. Yet the cruelty of the system was universal. Captives were stripped of their possessions, forced into humiliating inspections, and subjected to conditions designed to dehumanize and prepare them for their new roles as enslaved laborers. The identities they carried, their professions, spiritual practices, social roles, and familial connections were systematically erased as they were processed and commodified. The distinction between being a free person with a place in a community and being an object for trade could not have been starker. And the psychological toll of such erasure compounded the physical suffering that had already begun with their capture. Despite the overwhelming brutality, instances of resilience and subtle resistance occurred even before the captives boarded the ships. Some sought to flee during marches, hide in the forests, or appeal to local networks for assistance, demonstrating courage and ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. These acts, though often unsuccessful, highlight the humanity and agency of those subjected to such oppressive systems, showing that even when confronted with systematic dehumanization, individuals fought to maintain a sense of self and agency. Stories passed down through oral histories, letters, and later written accounts reveal that captives retained knowledge of their origins, their languages, and their communities, using memory and tradition as tools of survival. The process of capture and sale was not only a physical ordeal, but also a profound assault on culture and identity, one that the captives resisted in every way possible. The complexity of these interactions between raiders, local collaborators, and European traders underscores the tangled realities of the transatlantic slave trade. It challenges simplistic notions of victimhood and perpetration by showing how economic incentives, political pressures, and social hierarchies intersected to create a system in which human lives were commodified on a massive scale. Entire regions of West and Central Africa were destabilized by the constant threat of raids, with some communities forced to fortify villages, alter settlement patterns, or negotiate with traders to protect themselves. The cultural and social consequences of these disruptions were profound, affecting not only those captured but also those left behind, whose lives were reshaped by fear, loss, and the demands of a brutal commerce. The journey from capture to the coast also illuminates the logistics and organization behind the slave trade. Raiding parties operated with an efficiency that reflected both military skill and economic calculation. Captives were restrained, fed minimally, and moved in groups designed to minimize escape, while maximizing the number that could be delivered to European traders. This organization, while horrifying in its purpose, illustrates the systematic nature of the trade and the widespread human complicity that enabled it to persist for centuries. The captives, despite being treated as objects of commerce, carried within them a history, culture, an identity that resisted total erasure, laying the groundwork for the resilience and continuity of African traditions in the diaspora. As the captives arrived at the forts and were loaded onto ships, the horror of the Middle Passage was only beginning. Yet, the journey from capture to coast highlights a critical and often overlooked dimension of the transatlantic slave trade: the role of local dynamics, the betrayals and complicities that facilitated capture, and the remarkable endurance of the human spirit in the face of systematic dehumanization. Each captive carried with them memories of home, skills, and cultural knowledge that would survive, transform, and ultimately contribute to the resilience of African-descended communities across the Americas, ensuring that even the most brutal processes of enslavement could not fully extinguish the humanity of those subjected to it. The moment African captives were herded onto the decks of the slave ships, the horrors that had begun with their capture and forced marches were only intensified by the sheer brutality of life aboard these vessels, where the human body was treated not as a living being but as cargo to be packed, restrained, and moved with as little concern for dignity as possible. The ships themselves were massive yet paradoxically confining, constructed and modified for the express purpose of transporting hundreds of human beings across the Atlantic. And yet these modifications did nothing to mitigate the crushing conditions below deck. Men were shackled together in pairs, sometimes forced into positions so cramped that they could scarcely sit or turn, their limbs pressed against each other, their bodies entwined in chains that cut into skin already bruised and weakened from weeks of forced marches. Women were frequently left unshackled, but this freedom was largely illusory. It left them exposed to the predatory actions of crew members, who exploited every imbalance of power aboard the ship. And yet even without shackles, the women could hardly escape the oppressive density of the hold, where the air was thick, stifling, and laden with the stench of human waste, sweat, and fear. Children, often free to move but too young to protect themselves, found themselves navigating a world defined by confinement and terror. their laughter and cries swallowed by the oppressive weight of despair that permeated every corner of the ship. The stench was immediate and unrelenting. It mingled with the heat trapped beneath the decks, producing a suffocating atmosphere that made every breath an effort. And for many, a slow death. There were no sanitary facilities of any kind, and the necessary tubs placed aboard for the most basic human functions were inadequate, often leading to accidents that compounded the filth. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, from dysentery to smallpox, and once illness set in, there was little hope for recovery, as medical care was minimal and largely indifferent to the suffering of the captives. Captains and crews, motivated primarily by profit, prioritized the preservation of their investment over human life, often resorting to violence to maintain order or eliminate those deemed too weak to survive the journey. Starvation, thirst, and exhaustion were constant companions. Rations were meager, water scarce, and the human toll was staggering, with thousands dying before they could set foot on American soil. Despite these conditions, the captives maintained a fragile thread of resistance and solidarity, sharing what little comfort they could, supporting one another through song, prayer, or quiet companionship when the darkness of the hold threatened to overwhelm them. Yet the psychological pressure was immense. The constant fear of abuse, the threat of death from disease, neglect, or deliberate cruelty, and the realization that escape was nearly impossible created a crushing mental weight. The cries of women, the groans of the sick, the whimpers of children, and the despairing murmurs of men who had lost all sense of home and family filled the hold with a chorus of suffering, a sound that the crew often ignored or exploited to maintain control. There were moments of rebellion, where captives attempted to resist or seize control, even within the claustrophobic confines of the ship. Shackled men sometimes fought back with the limited strength they possessed. Women used their mobility and cunning to subvert the crew's authority, and in rare but notable cases, such as the revolt aboard the Amistad, captives successfully overcame their captors and took charge of the vessel. These acts of defiance, while dangerous, reflected the indomitable human spirit and the refusal to be reduced entirely to property. The very design of the ships with extra hatches, netting to prevent escape, and armed crews stationed above deck was a response to the persistent threat of such uprisings. And yet these precautions could never fully suppress the hope, ingenuity, and courage of those aboard. The daily life of captives was a sequence of suffering, punctuated by brief moments of reprieve, whether it was the chance to breathe slightly fresher air on deck, share a whispered word with a neighbor, or recall memories of home, family, and community. Yet even these moments were fragile. The oppressive heat, the foul air, and the ever-present threat of disease or punishment hung like a shadow over every interaction. Men who resisted were beaten. Women who defied expectations faced sexualized violence or coercion, and children were left exposed to both physical and psychological harm. The hierarchy aboard the ship ensured that the crew remained in control at all times, and the captive's vulnerability was systematically exploited. The Middle Passage was more than a journey. It was an orchestrated trial of endurance, a test of the human capacity to survive unimaginable cruelty, and a mechanism designed to strip away identity, autonomy, and hope. It was a passage where life was reduced to the most basic functions: breathing, eating, enduring under conditions so extreme that the mind and body were often pushed beyond breaking points. Yet in this suffocating darkness, fragments of resilience persisted, a song remembered from home, a whispered reassurance between captives, an act of shared defiance. These small gestures of human connection and memory, fragile as they were, laid the foundation for the survival of culture, tradition, and identity in the African diaspora, proving that even in the most oppressive circumstances, humanity could endure. The story of the slave ships, with their overcrowding, filth, shackles, and systemic violence, is a reminder not only of the horrors endured by millions, but also of the courage and resilience that persisted in the face of deliberate dehumanization. And it is through understanding this suffering that we can fully grasp both the magnitude of the transatlantic slave trade and the remarkable endurance of those who survived. The cruelty endured by captives aboard the transatlantic slave ships extended far beyond confinement and deprivation, reaching into a realm of deliberate physical and psychological violence that marked each day of the Middle Passage with terror and despair, a constant reminder that their lives were subordinated entirely to the profit motives of the crew. Captains, motivated by greed and a calculated sense of efficiency, enforced a brutal regime in which beatings, torture, and sometimes outright murder were not anomalies but instruments of control, intended to keep hundreds of human beings in a state of submission under conditions where resistance was as dangerous as it was inevitable. Shackled in pairs and pressed together in spaces scarcely taller than their own bodies, were beaten for any perceived disobedience, whether it was a failed attempt to communicate, refusal to perform minimal tasks, or simply an act of defiance, and the cruelty was meted out without restraint, often with instruments designed to maximize pain and suffering while leaving the person alive enough to endure the next day. Women, who sometimes enjoyed limited mobility below deck, were especially vulnerable. Their freedom from shackles offered little protection against sexualized violence, harassment, and arbitrary punishment, and for many, the journey became a daily negotiation of fear and survival in an environment designed to strip them of agency and dignity. Children, too young to comprehend the full scope of their captivity, witnessed and endured acts of brutality that left indelible marks on their minds and bodies, their cries often drowned out by the overwhelming cacophony of suffering around them. Yet each shriek contributed to the collective trauma of the hold, a shared experience of terror and endurance. The fate of those deemed unprofitable, sick, weak, or injured was particularly grim. Captains and crew, whose calculations of profit dictated the value of human life, often chose to throw these captives overboard rather than expend resources caring for them, a practice that transformed the ocean itself into a repository of countless lost lives. These acts were not always impulsive. They were frequently premeditated, carried out with cold deliberation, and in some cases justified under the logic of commerce, as the value of the cargo could be insured against drowning but not against illness or starvation. Such calculated cruelty reveals the depth of dehumanization inherent in the trade, in which people were reduced to units of labor and profit, their suffering instrumentalized for financial gain. The infamous case of the Zong in 1781 is emblematic of this mindset, where a crew, facing disease and scarcity, threw more than 100 sick and dying captives into the sea to claim insurance. The act, while legally contested, highlighted the normalized cruelty and commodification of human life in the transatlantic trade. Even beyond the threat of being thrown overboard, captives endured relentless torture designed to instill fear and maintain obedience. Whippings, beatings with rods or chains, and the use of devices intended to immobilize or inflict pain were daily occurrences, meted out with precision to ensure that resistance remained dangerous and costly. The psychological impact of these acts was profound. Fear, despair, and hopelessness permeated every level of life aboard the ship, leaving survivors physically weakened and mentally scarred. Captives learned quickly that defiance could provoke not only immediate punishment, but also serve as a warning to others, creating an atmosphere where terror was both a personal experience and a communal strategy of control. Yet even amid these conditions, instances of courage and resistance emerged, reflecting the unbreakable human spirit. Captives occasionally organized uprisings, striking back against their oppressors with the limited means at their disposal, whether through coordinated attacks, attempts to overpower guards, or acts of defiance so bold that they altered the course of entire voyages. The story of the Amistad Revolt stands out as a testament to the agency and resilience of those aboard, where captives, led by Joseph Sinker, seized control of the ship, demonstrating not only bravery but also strategic acumen and an enduring commitment to reclaiming their freedom. Even when such uprisings were suppressed, the very act of resistance signaled that captivity and oppression could not fully erase identity, dignity, or the desire for self-determination. In the midst of this terror, captives found ways to maintain fragments of humanity, whether through shared moments of solidarity, the memory of home and family, or the quiet preservation of cultural practices. Even as captains and crew attempted to reduce them to numbers and cargo, these acts of psychological resistance underscored the failure of the system to entirely dehumanize those it sought to exploit. The rituals of daily survival, finding ways to share scarce food, comforting the weak, or keeping spirits alive through song and prayer, became vital lifelines in a world where life was constantly threatened. Disease and malnutrition compounded the effects of violence, creating a lethal synergy that rendered the Middle Passage one of the deadliest journeys in human history. The cramped, unsanitary, and poorly ventilated holds became incubators for sickness, where dysentery, smallpox, and other maladies spread rapidly, claiming thousands of lives before the ship even reached the Americas. Captives weakened by illness were often considered liabilities, further increasing the likelihood of their being discarded into the sea. An ultimate act of cruelty that reinforced the expendability of human life in the eyes of the crew. The sheer scale of suffering aboard these ships, combined with the deliberate cruelty of captains and crews, illustrates the systematic violence that defined the transatlantic slave trade. Yet within this framework of brutality, the endurance, courage, and occasional resistance of the captives reveal a counter-narrative of resilience, showing that even in the most oppressive and dehumanizing conditions, human beings retained agency, hope, and the will to survive. The story of the Middle Passage is therefore not only a chronicle of unimaginable cruelty, but also a testament to the persistence of humanity in the face of calculated oppression, reminding us that the historical record is defined not only by suffering but also by the courage and resilience of those who endured it. The economic calculus of the transatlantic slave trade extended far beyond the mere act of capturing and transporting human beings, embedding itself into every decision made aboard the ships and revealing the cold, calculated logic that underpinned the suffering of millions. Captives were treated as commodities, and like any valuable cargo, their preservation was subject to the interests of profit and insurance policies that often created perverse incentives, in which human life was weighed against financial gain with terrifying impartiality. Ship owners and captains knew that insurance could cover the loss of their cargo if individuals drowned, yet policies rarely accounted for death by starvation, disease, or mistreatment, a loophole that frequently transformed calculated neglect or deliberate violence into a rationalized, though morally abhorrent, business strategy. In practice, this meant that captives who were ill, weak, or otherwise deemed unprofitable were at constant risk of being thrown overboard, not as an act of capricious cruelty alone, but as a financial decision designed to protect the investment in the remaining human cargo and to align with the rigid terms of maritime insurance contracts. The infamous Zong case of 1781 exemplifies this grim reality. The ship, heavily overloaded with 470 enslaved Africans, faced a deadly combination of disease, dwindling provisions, and treacherous mid-Atlantic doldrums. In a coldly rationalized measure, the crew threw 132 sick and dying captives into the sea to claim insurance compensation, a decision that, while legally contentious, underscored the deadly intersection of commerce and human cruelty. Insurance policies shaped the behavior of crews in insidious ways, creating a scenario in which neglect, underfeeding, and the deliberate acceleration of mortality became financially advantageous. Captives who might have survived under more humane conditions were often left in intolerable heat, deprived of sufficient food and clean water, chained together in suffocating compartments where disease spread rapidly, and denied even the most basic medical care unless it served to preserve the profitability of the voyage. Crew members were incentivized to prioritize their own survival over that of the captives, rationing major supplies with a focus on maintaining the strongest individuals as investment while allowing the sick or feeble to perish. The psychological burden of this reality extended to the captives themselves, who, aware of the arbitrary mechanisms of life and death on the ships, navigated each day with a combination of fear, vigilance, and the faintest hope that they might survive long enough to see land again. This system of economic dehumanization reinforced the broader machinery of oppression, where captives were denied identity, autonomy, and agency at every stage. The knowledge that their fates could be so easily decided by the cold arithmetic of insurance and profit intensified the psychological torment aboard the vessels, adding to the physical suffering of chains, overcrowding, and filth. Women, already vulnerable to abuse, faced additional risks as captains and crew sometimes exploited them sexually to maintain control or to manipulate perceived value for transactions at their destination. Children, separated from parents and confined within the same oppressive conditions, were thrust into a world where their survival depended not only on their physical resilience, but on their ability to navigate a system designed to treat them as expendable property. The air below deck was thick with the stench of human waste and decay, and each day brought the specter of illness, starvation, and the arbitrary violence of those entrusted with their transport. Yet even in this atmosphere, captives often sought solace in communal support, whispered encouragement, and the remembrance of home and kin. In addition to the immediate horrors, the insurance framework encouraged systematic practices that maximized the profitability of the voyage. Often at the expense of human life, ships were deliberately overcrowded to increase the number of captives transported per journey, while structural modifications such as low ceilings, narrow passages, and confined compartments compounded the suffering and increased mortality, a cost easily calculated against potential insurance claims. Starvation and disease were therefore not only incidental consequences, but predictable outcomes embedded in the operational logic of the trade, with crew members acting under a regime that treated human beings as replaceable units rather than sentient individuals. The combination of greed and regulatory loopholes produced a form of mechanical cruelty that was methodical, planned, and deeply entrenched, revealing the extent to which economic incentives can shape human behavior in devastating ways. Yet even in this environment, acts of resistance and resilience persisted, illustrating that captives retained agency and a sense of humanity despite the constraints imposed by economic structures and physical oppression. Attempts to revolt, such as those aboard the Amistad and other documented uprisings, demonstrated not only courage but an understanding of the systems designed to control them. Captives leveraged their knowledge, solidarity, and ingenuity to assert autonomy in situations where survival itself required constant negotiation. These acts were often dangerous and costly, yet they offered glimpses of human resilience and the refusal to be fully commodified, a counterpoint to the merciless logic of insurance and profit. The insurance-driven calculus of the slave trade also had broader social and moral implications, revealing the intersection of commerce, law, and dehumanization on an international scale. Court cases, public debates, and activist interventions occasionally challenged these practices, bringing attention to the inhumanity of reducing lives to mere financial instruments. However, despite legal scrutiny, the underlying incentives remained in place for decades, demonstrating how economic mechanisms can perpetuate cruelty when human life is subordinated to profit. The Middle Passage, therefore, was not only a physical and psychological ordeal, but a lens through which the moral contradictions of an economic system predicated on human exploitation become starkly visible. The legacy of these insurance practices is a sobering reminder of how profit-driven decisions can codify and exacerbate human suffering, transforming ordinary decisions into life-and-death judgments and reinforcing the systemic dehumanization that defined the transatlantic slave trade. At the heart of this history lies a paradox. The meticulous care for valuable cargo coexisted with extraordinary neglect and violence toward those deemed unworthy, reflecting a system that commodified human life while underestimating the resilience, courage, and enduring spirit of the captives themselves, whose stories of survival, resistance, and defiance continue to illuminate the profound injustices of this dark chapter in human history. Amid the relentless suffering, terror, and dehumanization aboard the transatlantic slave ships, moments of defiance emerged that revealed the resilience, courage, and ingenuity of captive Africans, illustrating that even in the most oppressive conditions, human agency could not be entirely extinguished, and that the will to resist, survive, and reclaim dignity persisted despite overwhelming odds. The cramped, suffocating holds of these ships were designed to suppress rebellion through sheer force, overcrowding, and the constant threat of violence. Yet captives, acutely aware of their plight and the opportunities for leverage, occasionally organized uprisings that tested the limits of the captors' control and reshaped the narratives of the Middle Passage. These revolts were not merely impulsive outbursts of anger but calculated, coordinated efforts requiring immense courage, detailed observation, and a deep understanding of both the environment and the vulnerabilities of the crew, highlighting the captives' capacity for strategic action even in conditions engineered to deny them power. Among the most famous of these uprisings was the revolt aboard the Amistad in 1839, where Joseph Cinque, captured in Sierra Leone, led a group of enslaved Africans to seize control of the ship off the coast of Cuba. Armed with knowledge of the ship's layout, makeshift weapons, and a shared determination for freedom, they overcame the crew, taking command of the vessel in a daring assertion of autonomy, navigating the complex dynamics of survival and resistance as they sought to return to African soil. The Amistad revolt eventually became emblematic of the broader struggle for justice, liberty, and recognition, culminating in a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision that affirmed the captives' right to freedom and underscored the human cost and moral imperative of confronting the injustices of the transatlantic slave trade. Yet the Amistad was far from an isolated incident. In 1841, the Creole uprising demonstrated that resistance was a recurring and persistent feature of the Middle Passage, and not merely a historical anomaly. Bound for New Orleans with 135 captives aboard, the enslaved Africans seized control of the vessel after killing some of the crew and compelling the rest to comply, navigating the ship to Nassau in the Bahamas, where the British authorities granted them freedom. This episode, like others, showcased not only physical courage but also tactical acumen, as the captives needed to balance force, timing, and the psychological leverage over their oppressors, a complex interplay that reflected both desperation and ingenuity. The success of the Creole revolt sent ripples through the transatlantic trade, challenging the assumptions of captains and merchants and demonstrating that the human spirit could resist and, at times, triumph even within a system designed to annihilate it. Long before the Amistad and Creole, other revolts punctuated the history of the Middle Passage, including the remarkable story of the Little George in 1730. Shortly after departing Guinea for Rhode Island with a cargo of 96 captives, a group of men aboard the ship managed to free themselves from their shackles, overpowering the crew in a carefully executed rebellion, killing some captors, and compelling the remainder to surrender. They navigated the ship back to the Sierra Leone River, liberating themselves while leaving a lasting testament to the courage and determination of those who refused to accept the fate imposed upon them. These uprisings were not without risk. captives faced retaliation, violent suppression, or death if unsuccessful. Yet their repeated occurrence reveals that resistance was a constant undercurrent of the transatlantic trade, undermining the notion that the captives were passive victims and asserting the persistent assertion of autonomy and human dignity. Resistance aboard slave ships often took multiple forms beyond full-scale revolts, including subtle acts of defiance and sabotage. Captives would sometimes refuse food, feign illness, or slow labor in ways that challenged the authority of the crew while minimizing immediate personal risk, demonstrating resilience and agency in microcosms within the oppressive environment. Cultural practices, oral traditions, and shared knowledge provided psychological sustenance, enabling captives to communicate, organize, and sustain a sense of collective identity even when every effort was made to erase it. These acts of quiet resistance, while less visible than dramatic uprisings, were essential threads in the fabric of survival and rebellion, revealing the multifaceted nature of human defiance against extreme oppression. The risks undertaken by those who revolted were immense, yet the rewards, both symbolic and material, underscored the importance of freedom and the rejection of dehumanization. Captives aboard ships like the Amistad, Creole, and Little George seized control not only of vessels but of their destinies, navigating unknown waters and confronting immense logistical, social, and psychological challenges to reclaim autonomy. These revolts illuminated the possibilities of courage and strategy under duress, offering lessons in resilience, solidarity, and the enduring desire for liberty that transcended individual circumstances to reflect a universal human impulse. The broader historical context of these uprisings also challenges simplistic narratives of power and victimhood. While the system of the transatlantic slave trade sought to commodify human life and suppress resistance through violence, regulation, and intimidation, the repeated emergence of revolts demonstrates that oppression, no matter how pervasive or technologically supported, is never absolute. The captives' ability to act collectively, to plan and execute revolts, and to assert their humanity under the most dehumanizing conditions reveals the enduring strength of identity, community, and moral agency. The stories of the Amistad, Creole, Little George, and countless lesser-known revolts collectively illustrate that resistance was woven into the very experience of the Middle Passage. They highlight not only the extreme hardships faced but also the courage, ingenuity, and determination of those who refused to be reduced to mere property. Through these acts of defiance, the captives reclaimed fragments of their lives, challenged systemic oppression, and created legacies that continue to resonate, reminding us that even in circumstances designed to strip humanity, the spirit to fight, survive, and reclaim dignity can never be extinguished. The history of revolt aboard slave ships, therefore, is both a testament to human resilience and a sobering chronicle of the oppression that sought to suppress it, revealing a narrative of courage and determination that endures as a powerful counterpoint to the calculated cruelty of the transatlantic trade. The experience of female captives aboard the transatlantic slave ships was marked by a cruel duality that combined the relative physical freedom of being unshackled with a profound vulnerability to abuse, exploitation, and relentless psychological terror, exposing the gendered dimensions of oppression that compounded the already horrific conditions of the Middle Passage. While men were often bound tightly in pairs, confined to cramped and suffocating compartments, women were typically left unshackled below deck or sometimes allowed limited movement on the upper decks, a superficial measure that offered freedom of motion but little real protection, leaving them exposed to the predatory behavior of crew members who wielded power without accountability. The lack of oversight or structured protection created a system in which sexual exploitation was rampant, as the hierarchy aboard the ship enabled captains and sailors to exercise dominance over female captives with impunity. treating their bodies as instruments of control and, in some cases, additional cargo whose perceived value could be manipulated for profit or gratification. Women faced the compounded horrors of witnessing the suffering of their peers, managing their own fear for survival, and attempting to navigate an environment in which resistance could provoke further violence, yet acquiescence offered no true safeguard. Historical accounts, including the harrowing experiences documented in the voyages of ships like the Clotilda, underscore the pervasive danger faced by women. Captives were stripped of clothing and examined upon boarding, not only to assess physical health but to evaluate their potential market value, a process that stripped them of autonomy and humanity while reinforcing their status as commodities. This dehumanizing system intersected with gender in ways that left women disproportionately vulnerable. Unlike male captives, whose physical shackling provided at least some nominal form of containment and control, female captives were subjected to the constant threat of unwanted attention and coercion, their freedom of movement serving paradoxically as a mechanism for exposure to abuse. In addition to the ever-present risk of sexual exploitation, women had to contend with the same appalling conditions that affected all captives. Overcrowding, filth, inadequate food and water, disease, and the terror of arbitrary violence. Their lives were governed by the whims of those in power, and the smallest act of defiance or perceived insubordination could trigger beatings, confinement, or even death, creating a constant psychological strain compounded by physical suffering. The stories of individual women aboard slave ships illustrate the grim reality of this gendered oppression. Accounts describe young women, barely teenagers, subjected to extreme punishments for refusing to comply with imposed routines or displays of performance designed to demonstrate health and vitality for sale. In one documented voyage, a 15-year-old girl was repeatedly flogged by the captain for refusing to exercise, a cruel attempt to mold her into a commodity while disregarding her distress and physical limits. In other instances, women were drowned or physically abused under the pretense of maintaining hygiene, health, or order aboard the ship, yet these acts were often thinly veiled strategies to protect the economic interests of the captors, underscoring the intersection of financial calculation, control, and gendered violence. The absence of protective structures for women, such as female shipboard matrons or conductresses who oversaw convicts and immigrants, left enslaved women without intermediaries who might have mitigated harm, intensifying their isolation and vulnerability. Despite these dire circumstances, women found ways to assert agency, navigate the perilous environment, and maintain a sense of identity and communal solidarity, even when survival seemed impossible. Some leveraged relationships and strategic compliance to protect themselves or their children, while others resisted in small but meaningful ways, such as concealing skills, knowledge, or cultural practices that might be exploited for profit. These acts of subtle resistance were often overshadowed by the broader horrors of the voyage, yet they represent the enduring human capacity to assert dignity and survival instincts in situations designed to erase both mothers, sisters, and daughters who were separated or threatened by the sale of family members developed networks of emotional and practical support, sharing whispered warnings, offering comfort, and preserving the memory of home, community, and family as a psychological lifeline. The intersection of gendered vulnerability and the commodification of human life on slave ships also illuminates broader social and economic structures underpinning the transatlantic trade. Female captives were not merely victims of physical confinement, but were caught in a system that assessed their bodies for marketable value while offering no safeguards against abuse, reflecting the ways in which economic imperatives amplified and exploited existing power imbalances. Sexual exploitation, coupled with the threat of violence and the omnipresence of disease and starvation, made survival a daily negotiation of risk, requiring constant vigilance. Adaptability. and resilience. The experiences of women during the Middle Passage, from the Clotilda to countless undocumented voyages, highlight the layered cruelty of the slave trade, demonstrating how gendered oppression intersected with systemic dehumanization to create a uniquely harrowing experience for female captives. In examining these narratives, one observes that the struggle for agency and dignity persisted even under conditions designed to eliminate them, as women resisted, endured, and, when possible, supported one another through the psychological and physical horrors of their confinement. Their stories remind us that the Middle Passage was not only a voyage of physical displacement, but a complex theater of human resilience, gendered vulnerability, and moral endurance, revealing the extraordinary fortitude of those who navigated unimaginable oppression while maintaining the threads of identity, community, and hope that would sustain them across continents and generations. In understanding the experiences of women aboard these ships, we gain insight into the broader human cost of the transatlantic slave trade, recognizing both the systemic cruelty of the enterprise and the remarkable endurance of those it sought to suppress, preserving the memory of lives that were systematically endangered yet never fully subdued. The narratives of survivors like Olaudah Equiano and Matilda Macria serve as some of the most compelling and humanizing windows into the brutal realities of the transatlantic slave trade, offering intimate perspectives that reveal the full spectrum of suffering, resilience, and long-term consequences endured by those forcibly uprooted from their homes and thrust into a life of captivity and dispossession. Their stories bridging the gap between historical abstraction and personal human experience. Equiano's account begins with his violent abduction as a child from his village, a moment that transformed him from a boy with a family, community, and cultural identity into a commodity to be traded across oceans, illustrating the suddenness and totality of the disruption that millions of Africans experienced during the period. He recounts the shock and terror of being separated from familiar surroundings, forcibly marched by captors, and ultimately confined in slave forts along the coast, where uncertainty, hunger, and fear became daily companions, a period that could last weeks or even months while awaiting the arrival of ships destined to carry them across the Atlantic. These early experiences, fraught with anxiety and vulnerability, foreshadowed the harrowing conditions of the Middle Passage, where Equiano and countless others would endure overcrowded, unsanitary, and suffocating environments, with the constant threat of disease, starvation, and violence looming over every moment. Equiano's memoir offers vivid descriptions of the shipboard conditions that so often defy comprehension, detailing the low, dark compartments in which men were shackled, the stench of unwashed bodies, and the incessant noise of suffering that filled the vessel. Women and children, while occasionally afforded slightly more space or unshackled movement, faced their own distinct dangers, including sexual exploitation and psychological torment, which underscored the gendered dimensions of cruelty embedded within the slave trade. The relentless pressure of confinement, coupled with the constant threat of punishment or death for minor infractions, created an environment in which mental strain and despair were as deadly as physical abuse. Equiano's testimony not only documents the material conditions of survival, but also illuminates the strategies captives employed to preserve a sense of humanity and community, from sharing limited resources to maintaining cultural practices and oral traditions that provided psychological sustenance and a reminder of life before enslavement. Equiano's narrative does not end with survival aboard the ship. It extends into the complex and often ambiguous realities of life in the Americas, where freedom, when achieved, was itself a precarious and contested condition. His journey from capture to eventual manumission underscores the long-term consequences of displacement, including the struggle to reclaim identity, navigate legal and social systems designed to marginalize, and cope with the intergenerational impacts of trauma. illustrating that the legacy of the Middle Passage extended far beyond the voyage itself. Equianos' reflections provide critical insight into the resilience of individuals who, despite the systematic stripping away of rights, culture, and family, found ways to assert agency, educate themselves, and advocate for broader societal change, ultimately contributing to the abolitionist movement and the historical record that informs our understanding of slavery today. The story of Matilda McCree, captured as a young child and transported aboard the Clotilda, the last known slave ship to bring Africans to the United States, similarly illuminates the human cost of the trade, particularly for those whose lives spanned the tail end of the transatlantic slave era. Abducted with her mother and sisters during a violent raid by the army of the West African Kingdom of Dahomey, McCree's early experiences were defined by forced marches, confinement, and the terror of being sold into a system that treated human beings as property, a fate that would shape her entire existence. Her arrival in Mobile, Alabama, aboard the Clotilda marked the beginning of a life characterized by separation from family, limited autonomy, and the daily negotiation of survival under conditions of systemic oppression. Despite the eventual abolition of slavery, McCree's life remained entangled with the long-term effects of her capture. Her family was fragmented, her labor commodified, and her opportunities constrained by the structural inequities that persisted after emancipation, reflecting the enduring legacies of trauma imposed by the slave trade. McCree's experiences also highlight the intersection of memory, testimony, and the preservation of historical narrative, as she became a living repository of the experiences of those who endured the Middle Passage. Her recollections, preserved through oral history and later documented by researchers, offer crucial insights into the resilience of enslaved communities, the continuity of cultural practices despite displacement, and the ways in which individuals navigated a world structured by racialized hierarchies and economic exploitation. Her story, like Equianos, demonstrates that survival extended beyond the immediate physical dangers of capture and transport. It encompassed the ongoing struggle for dignity, recognition, and the maintenance of human connections severed by the mechanisms of the slave trade. By connecting the experiences of Equiano and McCree to the broader narrative of the transatlantic slave trade, one gains a richer, more nuanced understanding of both the scope of suffering and the persistence of human resilience. Equiano's detailed observations and McCree's lived memory collectively underscore that the horrors of enslavement were not only material but deeply psychological, affecting individuals, families, and communities across generations. These first-hand testimonies remind us that history is not merely a chronicle of abstract numbers and dates but a tapestry woven from human lives, choices, and endurance, offering both a cautionary tale and a testament to the capacity of individuals to survive, resist, and preserve identity under unimaginable circumstances. The insights drawn from these survivors' stories are critical for understanding the Middle Passage as more than a historical event. It was a profound human experience that shaped the destinies of millions, created enduring diasporic communities, and left legacies that continue to inform cultural, social, and political realities today. Through the eyes of Equiano and McCree, we are granted access to the lived realities behind the staggering statistics, the intimate experiences behind the accounts of rebellion, suffering, and exploitation, and the profound consequences that extended far beyond the immediate horrors of capture and transport. Their narratives illuminate the complexity of survival and the indomitable human spirit, offering lessons about resilience, courage, and the enduring struggle for dignity that resonate across centuries and continents, ensuring that the stories of those who endured the transatlantic slave trade are neither forgotten nor diminished. The framework of the transatlantic slave trade was not merely a series of isolated acts of cruelty and violence, but a meticulously structured system driven by profit, reinforced and codified by European laws that consistently prioritized the protection and economic interests of ship crews over the lives, health, and dignity of the captives they carried, creating a legal and moral environment in which human suffering was subordinated to commercial gain. From the very outset, the captains, officers, and owners of slave ships operated under guidelines designed to maximize profit and minimize financial risk, and these rules were enshrined in the laws and insurance practices of European ports, which dictated how voyages should be conducted, how losses would be calculated, and under what circumstances compensation could be sought. Captives were rarely considered in these calculations except insofar as their survival affected the financial return on cargo. Disease, starvation, and death among enslaved Africans were often tolerated or even implicitly encouraged when such losses would not trigger compensation, creating a perverse economic logic in which neglect and abuse could be financially rationalized, while laws might dictate minimal standards for spacing, ventilation, or medical supervision. Their enforcement was typically motivated not by concern for human life, but by the desire to protect the investment represented by the crew and the cargo itself, ensuring that the ship remained seaworthy and that the captives did not threaten the delivery of profit, revealing the deeply entwined nature of legal frameworks and economic incentives within the transatlantic trade. The prioritization of crew safety and profit over captive well-being manifested in numerous, often brutal, practices aboard slave ships. Regulations required that captives be restrained and confined in ways that minimized rebellion and maximized control. Yet these same measures often intensified overcrowding, filth, and disease, showing the tension between operational efficiency and human cost. Crew members were guaranteed certain protections under law. Captains were empowered to enforce discipline through violence, and insurance policies frequently covered the loss of cargo only in cases of drowning or accidental death rather than deaths resulting from starvation, disease, or mistreatment, thereby creating a structural incentive to exploit, neglect, or even intentionally kill captives under circumstances that would yield financial reimbursement. The infamous Zong massacre of 1781, in which over 100 sick and dying captives were thrown overboard in an attempt to claim insurance compensation, exemplifies this intersection of law, profit, and moral indifference, demonstrating how legal and financial systems actively facilitated the systematic endangerment of human lives while maintaining the veneer of commercial legitimacy. The economic motivations of the transatlantic trade extended beyond the confines of individual voyages, shaping the broader network of commerce and colonization that underpinned European expansion in the Americas. Enslaved Africans represented not merely laborers but quantifiable assets whose value was calculated in terms of market price, productivity, and resale potential, reinforcing a commodification of human beings that was inseparable from the pursuit of profit. Laws governing trade, customs, and navigation reflected this reality, focusing on contractual obligations, property rights, and penalties for loss or rebellion in ways that rendered the captives as little more than movable wealth rather than sentient individuals, underscoring the structural exploitation embedded in every stage of the triangular trade. The intersections of legislation, commerce, and maritime practice ensured that the captives' suffering was systematized and predictable, allowing European merchants and investors to pursue wealth while circumventing moral and ethical responsibility. A chilling testament to the extent to which economic imperatives overshadowed human life. This legal and commercial architecture also influenced the psychological and social dynamics aboard the ships themselves. Captains and crews, aware that their actions were sanctioned and protected by law, often exercised authority with impunity, meting out violence, torture, and punishment with little fear of legal repercussion, while captives were left with few avenues for protection or redress. The structural emphasis on efficiency and profit over welfare created an environment in which cruelty became routine and rebellion was met with extreme measures designed to preserve the financial integrity of the voyage rather than the humanity of those aboard. Even when European governments eventually introduced regulations aimed at limiting the most egregious abuses, such as mandating surgeons or reducing the number of captives per ton of ship space, the underlying rationale was frequently to protect economic interests and crew survival, rather than to genuinely safeguard the lives of captives, revealing a persistent moral compromise inherent in the trade's legal framework. Yet, within this oppressive system, the resilience and resistance of captives highlight a profound tension between economic imperatives and human agency. Revolts on ships like the Amistad, Creole, and Little George, alongside countless small uprisings, demonstrate that captives actively contested the conditions imposed by profit-driven laws, asserting control over their own fates even in the face of systemic dehumanization. These acts of defiance not only disrupted the financial calculations of the traders, but also revealed the limitations of legal and commercial structures in fully suppressing human will, illustrating that the drive for profit, no matter how rigidly codified, could not entirely erase the moral and physical agency of those subjected to enslavement. Ultimately, the profit-driven and legally sanctioned nature of the transatlantic slave trade underscores the complexity of its historical legacy. By examining the ways in which European laws elevated crew and investor interests above the lives of captives, we gain insight into the structural cruelty that made the Middle Passage and the broader trade not merely a consequence of individual malice, but a systematized enterprise designed to exploit human labor and life for economic gain. Understanding this intersection of law, commerce, and human suffering is essential to appreciating the full scope of the trade's impact, as it illuminates both the mechanisms of oppression and the remarkable resilience of those who endured it. Shaping histories, societies, and diasporic communities that continue to bear its legacy today. As we reflect on the harrowing journey of the Middle Passage, it becomes evident that the transatlantic slave trade was more than a series of tragic events. It was a system that caused unimaginable suffering yet also revealed extraordinary acts of resistance, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. The conditions aboard the ships were abhorrent, cramped, unsanitary, and dehumanizing, with captives stripped of their identities, separated from their families, and subjected to physical abuse, malnutrition, and disease. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, Africans resisted in remarkable ways, whether through organized revolts, the preservation of cultural practices, or the quiet assertion of personal dignity amid relentless cruelty. These acts of defiance, though often met with brutal retaliation, underscored a profound determination to survive and maintain a sense of self despite the forces arrayed against them. The legacy of the Middle Passage extends far beyond the decks of the slave ships and the harbors where they departed or arrived. It shaped the African diaspora, dispersing millions of people across the Americas, Europe, and beyond, forging new communities, languages, and cultural traditions that persist to this day. Music, oral storytelling, culinary traditions, and religious practices carried by the enslaved transformed societies in the Americas and created resilient cultural identities that resisted erasure even under the harshest conditions. The forced migrations and systemic exploitation left deep psychological and emotional scars that were passed down through generations, affecting family structures, community cohesion, and individual identity. Yet they also fostered networks of solidarity and resistance that would eventually contribute to movements for abolition, civil rights, and social justice. Survivors' accounts like those of Aloda Equiano and Matilda Macria, offer intimate windows into the human experience of enslavement, capturing both the suffering endured and the courage exhibited in the face of overwhelming adversity. Their stories remind us that history is not merely a catalogue of statistics or events but a tapestry of lived experiences, emotions, and choices. Equiano's detailed recollections of capture, transport, and life under enslavement reveal the daily realities of oppression, while also highlighting the intelligence, adaptability, and resilience of those subjected to it. Macria's life, beginning with her capture as a child and continuing through her survival and eventual efforts to claim justice decades later, exemplifies the long-term impacts of the Middle Passage and the persistent struggle for recognition and dignity. Through their testimonies, we gain insight into the enduring human consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, reminding us of the importance of memory, acknowledgement, and reflection. It is crucial to recognize that the Middle Passage was not an isolated historical episode, but part of a broader system of global commerce, colonial exploitation, and racialized hierarchy, all driven by profit and sanctioned through laws that prioritized European interests over the lives of millions of Africans. The intertwining of economic incentive, legal structures, and social attitudes created a machinery of oppression that left indelible marks on history. Yet, amid this systemic dehumanization, the resistance, resilience, and cultural creativity of enslaved Africans ensured that their voices, identities, and legacies were never entirely extinguished. From the revolts aboard ships like the Amistad and Creole to the survival strategies and cultural expressions maintained in the Americas, the story of the Middle Passage is also a story of defiance, adaptation, and the persistence of humanity against immense odds. As we bring this exploration to a close, it is important to pause and reflect on the lessons embedded in this history. The Middle Passage teaches us about the devastating consequences of dehumanization, the moral dangers of subordinating human life to profit, and the resilience that emerges when individuals confront injustice. It reminds us that history is not distant or abstract, but intimately connected to present-day issues of racial inequality, social justice, and human rights. Understanding the depth of suffering endured and the courage displayed by those who lived through these experiences allows us to honor their memory while striving to ensure that such injustices are neither forgotten nor repeated. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this story, for witnessing the experiences and resilience of those who endured the Middle Passage, and for reflecting on the ongoing legacy of the African diaspora. Your attention and care help keep these histories alive and meaningful. And if you found this exploration compelling, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others so that more people can learn, reflect, and remember together. By supporting this work, you are contributing to the preservation of important historical narratives and fostering greater understanding of our shared human story. May the stories of endurance, courage, and resilience inspire you as you move forward, and may they serve as a reminder of the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Thank you for watching, and from all of us here, good night. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry hope, reflection, and the resolve to honor the lessons of history in your own life.